Hey, you sister students, it's Baker's Corner again. I hope you're doing wonderful, and I hope that y'all are doing well with this situation we're dealing with. We're going to continue our discussion today of the Reagan Part 2, which basically is going to focus mostly on Reagan's foreign policy, SDI particularly, and so forth. But before we get to that, we need to talk about his reelection of 1984. Now, a lot of you guys are familiar with, if you watch my first introduction on Reagan, that Reagan is one of those people that's going to try to push a conservative focus into the 80s. A lot of that's a response to some of the 60s activism and some of the other things in the 70s as well. But in 1984, Reagan has at this point in time, and we'll look at this in a moment in a little bit more detail, but he's already introduced this SDI program. He's already had a few, things that have started to kind of go a little bit in a positive direction as far as the economy is concerned. We're not out of the woods yet, as the saying goes, but he also has started to, kind of get some support from Congress to be able to start his tax cuts that were a big piece of the puzzle with Reaganomics, keep in mind. And so in 1984, he's up for re-election. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that in 1984, he's going to be running against the vice president that was under President Carter, a gentleman by the name of Walter Mondale. All right. And so a couple of you might be wondering, well, heck, I see these pictures that are on the screen right now. Those do not look like Walter Mondale. And you would be correct. And the reason why this is important, a lot of you are like, well, okay, I can kind of recognize in the modern day, that's a picture of Sarah Palin from back in the 2008 election. Why do we have her on there in 1984, if we're talking about 1984? And the reason being is because the woman that is above Sarah Palin, just a quick little note on this, is Geraldine Ferraro, who passed away probably about 5, 6, 7 years ago, whatever it's been now. She is going to be the first female to be put on a major party ticket on a presidential bid for president. All right. And so she basically did in 1984 what eventually Palin is going to do for the Republican Party in 2008. The big difference is, keep in mind, is that Ferraro is a Democratic candidate along with Mondale. Okay. And so there's all these different debates that they have, and there's some fun, I guess, thrown to Reagan's age. And if you want to watch the debate, it's kind of interesting the way that Reagan starts out one speech about Mondale's lack of experience not being held against him. But at the end of the day, Reagan has done enough to be able to win this election by, I think, what most historians would agree is a landslide. Okay. Mondale only won the District of Columbia, which is 3 electoral votes, and also the electoral votes from his home state of Minnesota. And therefore, that leaves well over 500 electoral votes for Reagan, and I think around 60% of the popular vote as well. So he won this by a pretty considerable margin. And so the question is, what is really going to be his second term? Well, his second term is going to be trying to weather the storm of some scandals that take place. We'll look at that more in a moment and briefly. And then also a couple of crises and trying to improve upon some of the relations with us in the Soviet Union, right? And it just so happens, as I mentioned, guys, in my last presentation, that one of the things that really I think is a good transition to U.S.-Soviet relations, or at least productive, is definitely going to be that change in leadership with Mikhail Gorbachev. All right, Gorbachev, I don't think becomes the leader of the Soviet Union the way we think of eventually, like Boris Yeltsin and Vladimir Putin, etc. Putin, of course, would be Russia along with Yeltsin. But anyway, down the line, but he's going to be more open-minded to an extent. If you've ever heard of glasnost perestroika, more openness, those kinds of things. Definitely Reagan, I think, is going to benefit a lot from a more open-minded, shall we say, Soviet leader. Okay. And so he transitions And what happens? Well, within about a year and some change of his second term, we have one of the bigger crises, which we will watch the Challenger disaster speech by Reagan. Now, this happened, guys. I want to paint a picture for you since we're not going to be physically in class. I remember I was in fifth grade when this happened. And like any kid, most kids, they're really interested in space and the shuttles and all these different things. You know, the moon landing is, what is it, about 16 years old at this point in time, a little bit less than 17. Anyway, so it's been around. Everybody knows about it. And so in late January of 1986, this is supposed to be a really great day. And I remember, you know, back then we had the bunny ear televisions. The parents that might watch this, or some of the older people might recall that too. And so therefore it wasn't easy just to go turn the TV on and watch television from the general classroom like now, more so. And I remember one of our teachers wheels in, you know, and it was a big, big privilege to watch something back then, guys. Anyway, no YouTube. And so she comes in and she's like, you know, we're going to watch the space shuttle. And of course, there's probably, I don't know, 15, 16, fifth grade kids. We're all on the floor. We're getting ready to watch it. Of course, the space shuttle launches. You know, we're all excited. And not long into it, of course, we see the explosion. Okay. And I remember just, I don't know if I cried that day, but I certainly was like, man, what happened? Right. Well, that evening, guys, if you didn't know this, Reagan was supposed to give his required by the Constitution State of the Union address, which he eventually did later. But he scrapped the plan. And if you ever read, guys, any of the Reagan biographies, which are very interesting, even there's one that I have that's actually, you know, he did a very detailed record of his presidency, you know, taking like diaries and journals. One of the few times where he doesn't reflect regularly is, of course, you know, a lot of you might know this, after his assassination attempt by John Hinckley in 1981. So he had not been in office very long, but he reflects on that. And guys, very, you know, just upset. And he, and of course, his wife then was Nancy Reagan. And so he presents, you know, his reflection, and it's kind of like, you know, I remember my mom, you know, this, like I said, was 86. So I was into Atari and video games, and you know, my mom was like, Dustin, come in and watch this. And at first I was like, nah, that's okay, I'm going to keep playing the game. And mom said, no, you really need to come in. So of course, listen to mom. The address is, you'll see, guys, if you do my assignment in after this video. um, and it's very interesting to see the way that he presents, you know, that tragedy and trying to console the American people, NASA, you know, et cetera. Right. So there'll be a little bit of analysis to do there. But why do I bring that up? It's his way of using a skill of his, which they called him the great communicator, to actually try to console the American people, because we're hurting. Now, it's not the same thing as, you know, obviously a war or something along the lines of people suffering because of a depression, or, you know, a COVID-19 thing like we are now, but it is still something that caught very much the national eye, and to an extent, the world eye. Okay. And so a lot of historians would argue that this event, you know, if you look at like some of the other scandals like Iran Contra, a few other ones that we'll not focus on as much, you know, this, I think it's safe to say a lot of historians would agree that this second term, like in many presidents' cases, not all of them to be sure, is going to be a more difficult task to move us forward. Okay. And so his legacy is going to basically be affected by, not, I mean, he doesn't have direct control over what happened with this, but definitely in some respect with, you know, Iran Contra, with, you know, funding and things like that. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Okay. However, the thing foreign policy wise that's going to define his second term is going to be what we call the Strategic Defense Initiative, AKA the Star Wars. Now, those of you can see my Star Wars shirt today. All right. Those students of mine know that I'm a big Star Wars junkie or whatever. All right, so we're going to incorporate a little bit into this to introduce it that has a little bit of a fun side to it. But a lot of you might be wondering, Mr. Baker, are you just making that up, calling it Star Wars? And the answer is no, right? A lot of that goes back to the media, right? Magazines, the media that we see, of course, on the TV, really kind of playing this up. Okay, so we'll look at the basic ideas in a second, and we're going to look at what Reagan has to actually say regarding this Star Wars program. Okay, so what are our objectives today? First of all, we want to be able to explain what is SDI, as it was known as for short, aka Star Wars, and analyze the extent to which you think the program was necessary for Cold War security against the Soviet Union. Now, we have to keep this in mind. We have hindsight being 2020 on our side. We know that as of now, the Cold War is over, right? They did not know that back in 1983 when Reagan, I think it was in March, when he first presented this as an idea. All right, we'll get to that more in a second. So you got to kind of forget what you might know, and you got to be a little bit objective here, but I think we can handle that. Secondly, we want to be able to describe the importance of foreign policy change with the Soviet Union following the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev as head of state in the Soviet Union. Okay, so what's going to be some of the positive outcomes, the meanings that they have in different parts of the world to open up more dialogue and eventually some arms agreements, which we'll speak briefly about. Thirdly, explain Reagan's use of military influence in other parts of the world during his tenure as president. It's very easy to be like, well, we just focused on the idea of SDI and trying to make sure the Soviet Union was not as likely to attack us. That's not really entirely true, right? So we'll look at a couple of examples, how he acts with Libya and Lebanon and, even Grenada, right? Which is not really that far from the United States, but it's still something that usually stands out. Okay, and then kind of bringing a little bit of food for thought, if you will, from our first intro to what we're going to look at briefly today. We want to be able to think about the legacy of Reagan with his domestic and foreign policy. Now, one thing for the younger viewers to keep in mind, Reagan basically survives his presidency by about almost 15 years. Okay. In fact, I think it was a little bit more than that. I want to say it was June of 2004 when he passed away. Okay. So anyway, we, like any president, any figure of major historical value, we want to ask ourselves that question. All right. So a lot of students are like, what is a good basic working definition of SDI before we look at what Reagan has to say about it, presenting it to the people? And this is basically a good basic description. A satellite shield in space to intercept and destroy incoming Soviet missiles. Now, a lot of you are thinking, man, that sounds really sophisticated, really high tech, and of course, it would have been. We did not complete the entire thing from start to finish. And the reasons you all probably have figured out that once the Soviet Union eventually falls in the early 1990s, then there's a lot of thought about, do we continue it, do we not? But we did make some progress on the SDI or Defense Initiative. Okay, I read in some sources that some people estimated, now keep in mind, Congress is going to have to give their support for the spending on this, right? So if you're Reagan, right, we're going to look at a short speech. The one that he made to the public is a little bit longer, or shall we say the American people. But I saw estimates as high as anywhere from 100 billion to 1 trillion American dollars in cost. Now, a lot of you are thinking, well, Mr. Baker, $1 trillion, we hear about that with the current stimulus all the time, and I'm not bringing that up to be political. But guys, you got to remember, we are not inflating that by 1983 money to 2020. That is what they estimated it to be in 1983. All right. Now, a lot of you are thinking, well, did they get it? Did they spend all that money? The answer is no, right? There's different estimates, but the one I've came across most recently was They estimated that we actually spent about 30 billion on the project. Okay. And so a lot of people are like, well, where's the Soviet Union? Well, keep in mind, our economy was in pretty bad shape in the earlier 80s. Their economy is going through an even worse situation. So you could argue, is this Reagan and the administration's way of outspending the Soviets? There's different sort of opinions on that. But last but not least, before we look at a couple of quick video clips, some questioned whether this concept would even work. Okay. So if some of you are wondering, okay, what does this SDI look like? And guys, there's a ton of science to this we're not going to get into. But again, I mean, you're looking at a very complex system that looks like something that some people would say, well, man, in 2020, maybe that's possible. But what about in 1983? And more importantly, the other question is, okay, whether it's possible or not, the question would be, do the Soviets really believe that we have the capability of actually doing something like this? Okay. And I'll get to that more in a moment. Okay. So guys, ponder this image. Think about your thoughts on that. All right. Would you have, your member of Congress or even the president, the one that's got to get them on board? What do you think this is a feasible idea given the tension that's, been developing for the last 40 years almost? Okay. And then we're going to see what Reagan has to say about it. And then we're also going to see what the concept really was in kind of a more creative way. So hold on just a moment and think. Okay, guys, I hope you're with me again. So what we're going to watch now, just very quickly, is Reagan making a speech on this. Now, this is not the famous one that he gave that was geared toward the American public. Okay, but as you watch this, as you'll see, it's only a little bit, but the portion we're going to watch is a little less than 3 minutes. I want you to think about how he presents it. Now, you could say the how being the words that he uses, maybe, the context of what he has to say, those kinds of things. And secondly, and maybe more importantly for all of us, if you were watching this is new, right? This is not something that's been around for over 37 years now. Would you have supported this, right? Even as an American taxpayer, okay? Think about it, and we'll get back to it here in a second.
As president, it's my solemn duty to ensure America's national security while vigorously pursuing every path to peace. Toward this end, I have repeatedly pledged to halt the decline in America's military strength and restore that margin of safety needed for the protection of the American people and the maintenance of peace. During the last several years, a weakening in our security posture has been particularly noticeable in our strategic nuclear forces, the very foundation of our strategy for deterring foreign attacks. A window of vulnerability is opening, one that would jeopardize not just our hopes for serious productive arms negotiations, but our hopes for peace and freedom. Shortly after taking office, I directed the Secretary of Defense to review our strategy for deterrence and to evaluate the adequacy of the forces now available for carrying out that strategy. He and his colleagues, in consultation with many leaders outside the executive branch, have done that job well. And after one of the most complex, thorough, and carefully conducted processes in memory, I am announcing today a plan to revitalize our strategic forces and maintain America's ability to keep the peace well into the next century. Our plan is a comprehensive one. It will strengthen and modernize the strategic triad of land-based missiles, sea-based missiles, and bombers. It will end long-standing delays in some of these programs and introduce new elements into others. And just as important, it will improve communications and control systems that are vital to these strategic forces. This program will achieve 3 objectives. It will act as a deterrent against any Soviet actions directed against the American people or our allies. It will provide us with the capability to respond at reasonable cost and within adequate time to any further growth in Soviet forces. It will signal our resolve to maintain the strategic balance, and this is the keystone to any genuine arms reduction agreement with the Soviets. Let me point out here that this is a strategic program that America can afford. It fits within the revised fiscal guidelines for the Department of Defense that I announced last week. During the next 5 years, the entire cost of maintaining and rebuilding our strategic forces will take less than 15% of our defense expenditures. This is considerably below the 20% of our defense budget spent on strategic arms during the 1960s, when we constructed many of the forces that exist today. It is fair to say that this program will enable us to modernize our strategic forces and at the same time meet our many other commitments.
Okay, so guys, you heard firsthand from President Reagan his goals, his reasoning, etc. And the one thing I want to point out to you before we watch this quick little fun video that kind of gives a little bit of fun to it, but also unpacks it a little bit more, is when you get into him using the term deterrence. And I know that's a term, if you've done a lot of reading on the Cold War, you might be familiar with, but for those that aren't, the idea of deterrence is kind of like the idea if you have something about your defense posture, right, in this case, that basically makes another country like a Soviet Union or whatever country it might be, you could pinpoint a few other ones, but we'll use that one as an example in the 80s, then deterrence is basically, they kind of think about, okay, does that country have a weapon that would make me not want to get more involved with attacking it or basically using military force? Okay. And so that's where, when he's talking about, in the early part of that short address, um, where are we as far as our nuclear deterrent? I don't think he used that exact word, but other presidents before him, like Kennedy, et cetera, did. That's what we have to consider. Okay. So the big question is, what, in addition to developing all this technology to be able to shoot all these incoming Soviet missiles out of, the atmosphere and all that, well, we said that it was called Star Wars for a reason. And here's a little bit more depth on that. All right, so I had to throw that in there for the Star Wars junkies like myself. But the big thing, guys, I want you to think about is, again, was it, in you all's opinions, a necessary measure, right, to basically move us forward with this idea of strategic defense initiative, et cetera, et cetera? Okay, so let's take a look really quick at where we left off. So again, you're looking at a pretty sophisticated thing. Now, the question is, all right, this is a big concept, costly. Now, in Reagan's view, it's within the spectrum of the budget, okay? But it does add, other things, military spending to certainly to our national defense, okay? And the question that we have to ask ourselves is, was the Soviet Union convinced that this was possible, et cetera, et cetera? Okay. Well, take a look at the transition of leadership to Gorbachev. I once attended, just a real quick story on this, a presentation by Michael Reagan, who's the son. He was a son of Reagan and his first wife, Jane Wyman. Okay. And so evidently, when Reagan would meet with Gorbachev, right, they had all these summit meetings and, places like Austria, et cetera. And Michael Reagan told the story. He said, almost every conversation between the two leaders, SDI was brought up by usually Gorbachev. Okay. And so according to the story, Gorbachev would always ask, or a lot of times would say to Reagan when they would meet, are you going to stop or halt the production of SDI? given the progress that we're making, right? You know, the INF treaty starts, you know, some of the other policies with the Soviet Union. And evidently, Reagan wasn't as proficient in Russian as Gorbachev was with having some English skill. But according to Michael Reagan, he would always say "niet," meaning no, right? So, you know, would the Cold War have came to an end without this? That's for you all to do a little bit more research and certainly some searching on. But there are some schools of thought out there that it does move us in the direction of better negotiations and, of course, eventually perhaps the fall of the Berlin Wall. Okay. Keep in mind that event does not happen until post Reagan, but only by about 10 months. Okay. So you do have some breakthroughs with Soviet-U.S. relations, treaties, etc. The question is, what basically is going to be involved with other areas? Well, I already mentioned briefly Grenada. Okay, so Grenada, if you don't know much, guys, about Grenada, you can research the map of it, but it's basically kind of like in America's backyard. Um, Basically, the thought on this was that this relatively small island nation was sympathetic to communism from Cuba. Reagan, of course, his administration was not supportive of that. So therefore, you have this campaign to basically go in and essentially take out the leadership of Grenada. Okay. A lot of people ask the question, was Grenada really that big of a communist threat? Well, there's different views on that. But at the end of the day, you know, if you're trying to limit, again, you know, the possibility of a Cuban communist, you know, satellite nation or whatever you want to call it, then the argument is that you basically have a responsibility to respond. The other examples here are Reagan basically acting in terms of the Middle East. Okay, so Lebanon, for example, you're going to see involvement there. That is not going to bode as well. You do have some American casualties as a result of this peacekeeping effort. Okay, and then also a lot of you guys might remember Gaddafi from a while back. He was also kind of a big threat, and Reagan does order some airstrikes. Of course, Israel was supportive of those as well. The idea was that you had terrorist activity there, and therefore there was a lot of back and forth between Libya and the United States over that. Reagan, to my knowledge, does not really, you know, have a lot of um, second thoughts about how, you know, we should basically take some degree of action. But the big thing that I'm going to end with before we wrap this up is, you know, when you think about Reagan's second term, there's a lot of things that come out regarding things like the Iran-Contra scandal. Okay. Now we're going to go over it very briefly, but you're welcome to research it more. But, you know, the big picture here, guys, is that you've got, remember, you know, even though this is in 1986 and Watergate was, you know, the earlier 70s, you still have a lot of people that remember those kinds of things, right? So when you start to hear the word scandal, corruption, things like that thrown around, you know, you've got, you know, enough of a voter base and enough of a population to be able to think back and be like, okay, here we go again, kind of thing. Okay. And so a lot of people are like, okay, well, why does this happen? Well, there's different theories, but one of the biggest things that pops into my mind is the fact that Reagan, remember, was a pretty hands-off president. You know, he believed in giving a lot of authority to people that were basically below him, right? So, you know, in this case, you know, when you're looking at, you know, you've got Nicaragua, which is in Central America, keep in mind, we don't want them to fall to, you know, a communist regime. And Congress has passed legislation that said that we are no longer going to give them direct money and aid. This is where you eventually have the scandal, because essentially arms sales happened, you know, with you know, some hostages that had been left over from some Middle Eastern things. We basically, you know, under the table, took the money, you know, funded these 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 Nicaraguans against the communist folks. Okay, And basically what happens is that these Contras were fighting the Sandinistas. The problem with that is technically that goes against that congressional legislation. Reagan, guys, as president, keep in mind, is going to basically have to make a lot of, you know, statements about this, but he doesn't do it right away. Okay. So as you can imagine, you know, if you've ever heard of like Colonel Oliver North, right, there's a lot of attention brought to him and, you know, things like that. Reagan does eventually acknowledge that something happened. Okay. The question that you want to think about, guys, with your assignment, right? You're going to be analyzing the speech on the challenger and then this speech. They're two very different speeches. One is for really a universal audience, you could argue. This one dealing with the Iran Contra, addressing a more, you know, maybe a more adult-like or maybe a more mature issue, as some people would put. So I want you to think about when you analyze those two things with Reagan. Now, a lot of people are like, okay, does his approval rating go down? It does, as you can imagine. Because even if Reagan doesn't directly order, okay, supply these Contras with weapons, et cetera, okay, the question is, and we talked about corruption earlier in the year with, you know, Ulysses S. Grant, et cetera, you know, you might not be the one that pushes the button on it, but it's still your administration that it happens under, okay? And so that's something that I want you all to think about. So Reagan does leave office with a reasonably high approval rating. I think it was well over 50%, okay? And that leaves us with this big question of any president, and that is their legacy. So I want you to ponder that. Email me with any questions, guys. This is Baker's Corner. You are now in a position to start your primary source assignment. Again, you're watching speeches rather than actually reading them. Okay, and you're going to do an analysis of a lot of principles associated with those speeches. So feel free to email me. Let me know if you have any questions. And as always, stay safe. And I will look forward to seeing you all hopefully soon. Take care, and I'll see you later.